France dreamed big. Not just of borders, but of belonging. Empire for them wasn't just territory, it was a mirror. The colonies would reflect the Republic back to itself, in French, of course.
French public memory of the colonial period is of the civilizing mission.
The idea of spreading civilization was really a way to unify people in France in a kind of patriotic way behind the idea of colonial expansion.
But there was also, from the more Republican side of French politics, the argument that in some way France was a superior culture and that people would be better off ruled by the French.
Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Except, funny thing, those words don't always travel well.
Within the first few decades of colonization, we believe that upwards of 1 million Algerians perished as a result of the violence of conquest, and also as a result of expropriation of land.
Wait, I thought the French Empire was about freedom. Yes, freedom. To become French, or at least almost French. Or to be told you're French until the paperwork says otherwise. Like an exchange student? Except no exchange, and no return ticket. That doesn't make any sense. Precisely. So sharpen your pens and conjugate your verbs. Welcome to Lesson 2. How to assimilate with style. Reality check. The French Empire was one of the biggest empires on Earth, stretching across Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. It exported French language, schools, and law as civilization, while ruling millions of people who had limited control over their own future. The borders, wars, and migrations that came out of that empire still shape today's France, and a lot of the world, long after the tricolor came down. That's what we're exploring today. How France tried to turn difference into Frenchness, and what that did to the people who never got to choose. In 1885, French statesman Jules Ferry stood before Parliament and said the quiet part out loud. Superior races have a right because they have a duty. The duty to civilize inferior races.
It was a very paradoxical concept. Certainly, we don't oftentimes think today of colonialism as being liberating, but that is very much what the French believed. They believed that their values that came out of the Enlightenment could do just that.
They called it la mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission, a convenient blend of Enlightenment ideals and economic strategy.
By civilizing people, they meant to spread ideas like liberty, political freedom, economic rationality, capitalism, essentially.
The French model was very much one of, as it were, projecting French culture. And that projection included French language, it included educating as many people as possible, definitely the elite.
Unlike other empires obsessed with loot, France wanted loyalty, hearts, minds, and mouths pronouncing bonjour.
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 Wait, he just sold colonialism like it's a self-help course. Should I be taking notes? Yes, and yes. Liberty, now with exceptions. See subsection 12C. Exhibit A, Senegal's 4 communes. Saint-Louis, Dakar, Gorée, Rufisque. In 1848, Paris extended French citizenship there, in theory. However, most Africans were labeled originaires, citizens who still fell under Islamic or customary law, a loophole dressed as inclusion.
The reality on the ground was that rights were oftentimes denied, in fact, most times denied to colonial subjects. Colonial subjects oftentimes had no pathway really to citizenship.
Only a small educated elite, the Evolué could climb the ladder to full citizenship, but the price was steep.
You had to give up the idea of Islamic law, for example, to accept French secular law. This, I think, created quite a bit of resentment on the part of many colonized subjects.
They have to renounce their right to be judged in a Muslim court, even though the Muslim courts are under French jurisdiction, in order to actually potentially get citizenship, which very few do, beginning in 1865 with the personal status laws.
Sounds like equality existed, just not for the people it was promised to.
Bureaucracy makes a great disguise for inequality.
Our cameraman in the French West African port of Dakar sends back a record of present-day life in that important place.
Assimilation came packaged as education. Language first, then loyalty.
All education during the colonial period was in French, and French is the official language now of all France's former colonies in sub-Saharan Africa.
And you can still see that to an extent in modern France, in that the surviving French colonies, places like Réunion, Martinique, Guadeloupe, are represented in the French Chambre des Députés. They're actually, as it were, France.
There was great pride that came to many that people were, in theory, learning French, learning the French language, learning French culture. The reality on the ground, however, remained quite blurry.
In Indochina, children copied French dictation while local scripts were sidelined. In Africa, classrooms preached loyalty to Marianne over local religious and communal identities.
Schools are dismantled for chronic Arabic or classical Arabic under the French regime, so Arabic kind of falls aside as a language.
To be fair, contemporaries pointed to gains. Mastering French opened jobs as clerks, teachers, and lawyers, people who could move between the colony and the metropole.
Some of them actually became ministers in French governments during the Fourth Republic between 1946 and 1958.
From those benches came figures like Léopold Senghor, poet and later president of Senegal. Legal pathways, however narrow, allowed figures like Blaise Diagne to win election to the French Chamber in 1914, the first black African deputy. Once language rewrote the mind, the next frontier was the soul.
The French in West Africa, parts of West Africa, and in Algeria in particular, had a very uncomfortable relationship with Islam.
So in terms of Islam, as a religion, a lot of different French actors, ethnographers, state officials, military officials, artists, and once again even feminists are writing about and are denigrating Islam and trying to pinpoint Islam as a source of the backwardness of the local population.
Islam in Algeria was administered by the colonial state. Imams licensed, religious courts constrained.
In Algeria, we have this legal system that is extremely repressive towards Algerian Muslims. It is basically this system of exceptionalism, that basically the laws that apply to Europeans do not apply to the Algerian Muslim majority.
So if you pray the wrong way or learn in the wrong place, you're suspicious?
Bingo! Your beliefs are a security issue, not just a spiritual one.
And the French get to say, we're not repressing you, we're just organizing society.
Reform, public order, civilization, nice words for a system that declares which lives are guided and which are disposable. In Indochina, Buddhist institutions were sidelined in favor of French schools.
Repression and reform were combined in French policy. Repression was used, for example, in Madagascar in 1947. Something like 180,000 to 100,000 Madagascans were killed there.
These ceremonies were propaganda, unveiling as liberation, French values as modernity. But behind the optics was a war being fought in villages, prisons, and streets.
So those are the kinds of things that French people like to remember. Africans, on the other hand, remember different things. They remember, for example, the repression to which they were periodically subject. They remember the denial of rights, of equal rights. They remember France's reluctance to make good on its promises of the one and indivisible republic with shared rights and equality.
Still, it wasn't all one-way repression. French secular ideals and Catholic networks did create new social spaces.
You also actually see how empire, however much it's a system of control, also gives agency to those people who are ruled or controlled or incorporated, or whatever phrase you wish to use.
Mission schools educated women who later became activists. Some Algerian reformists used French rhetoric about liberty to challenge patriarchy at home.
So Algerian Muslim women had been talking about, or there was sort of discourse about rights, and actually they looked more in terms of improving women's condition in the interwar period.
Religion and culture weren't just collateral, they were battlegrounds. Still, every awakening has a budget. Once minds were molded, the next project was profit. Empire needed cash crops, quotas, and bodies to move them. Cotton, coffee, cocoa, peanuts, rubber, grown for Paris, not for local markets.
It's very interesting to look at the relationship between French ideology and a reality of often economic exploitation, and obviously economic exploitation in all sorts of different ways, from coerced labour to the, as it were, seizure of raw materials.
The recruitment of labor was oftentimes achieved through violent means, either through directly forcing men and women to work at gunpoint, say, or through threats of taxation or even kidnapping, forcing men to come forward and agree to work, through systems of indentured labor.
By law, adults could be conscripted for weeks at a time. Projects like the Congo-Ocean Railway cost tens of thousands of African lives.
How bureaucracy functioned oftentimes was that it could create its own kind of rationale by saying, well, obviously there's not any kind of, say, mistreatment of labor. Laborers are not housed poorly. Laborers are not forced into work situations. When they can just simply point to the rules and regulations that say that those things were impossible. In reality, however, these sorts of abuses were going on with some regularity.
To some contemporaries, this looked like progress. Railways did connect coasts to interiors. Export crops brought wages for a minority who found steady work. Cities like Dakar and Abidjan grew into hubs that remain vital today.
Civilization? Or just capitalism dressed in tricolor cloth?
Oh, you're starting to ask the right questions. Algeria was the jewel in the French crown. Not a colony, but officially part of France itself.
French colonialism begins in Algeria in 1830, when the French military comes in, starts a very long conquest that is extremely violent.
The Mediterranean, they said, wasn't a border. It was a bridge. Except the bridge had toll booths, and Muslims rarely got across. In 1865, a law confirmed that Algerian Muslims could apply for citizenship, but only if they abandoned Islamic personal law.
They had to agree to go by French law. So Islam really was separated, I think, in Algeria from the French educational system quite starkly.
In 1870, the Crémieux Decree granted automatic French citizenship to Algeria's Jews, while Muslims remained subjects. One land, two sets of rules. By 1936, the Blum-Violet proposal to extend citizenship stalled. Another paper bridge to nowhere. Educated Algerians, the évolués, once believed in assimilation. Farhat Abbas, a Western-educated Algerian politician and early advocate for assimilation, even declared in the 1930s that Algeria had no nation but France. Yet by the 1940s, after decades of second-class status, Abbas and others turned nationalist. Assimilation had promised equality. Reality had bred rebellion. Still, Algeria's paradox produced new politics. The Cremieux Decree integrated Jews into French civic life. Evolué gained education, professions, and a voice, however limited, in municipal councils. But those cracks in the system also gave rise to leaders and movements that eventually demanded independence.
For some of the mujahidat, or the Algerian female resistance fighters who joined the FLN during the revolution, the nationalist movement, they're the ones we have the most oral stories with and oral histories with because of the efforts of people like Jamila Amran and Natalia Vance. They point to this discrimination that they experienced at school as part of the reason for which they ultimately decided to support nationalism and independence.
Teach someone freedom long enough and they'll start asking why they don't have it.
That's right. Assimilation was supposed to create loyal French subjects. Instead, it often produced rebels fluent in French ideals.
When it became obvious that France wasn't going to be able or wasn't politically willing to deliver on that promise of equality, African political leaders began to turn towards independence as their key demand.
Léopold Senghor, Aimé Césaire, Ferhat Abbas, all educated in French schools, turned those lessons against empire. The pen that signed decrees also signed declarations of independence. To France, this was betrayal. To the colonized, it was consistency.
African leaders said, okay, we're part of the one and indivisible republic, so we want that to become real. We want real equality.
If liberty was universal, then colonial subjects demanded it too.
As early as the early 20th century, you see colonial subjects writing letters to governor generals, to NGOs, to international organizations, complaining that they're not gaining the kinds of liberty and justice and equality that the universalist ideals promised.
The mission civilisatrice taught its subjects how to speak French, read Rousseau, and claim equality. And when they did, empire found itself on the receiving end of its own revolution. When France lowered its flags in Africa, it didn't pack up its influence. It just changed the logo.
It's often referred to as France-Afrique. There's these sort of official, semi-official, unofficial links between France and Africa, which take all sorts of different forms, sometimes legal, sometimes not so legal.
Behind the speeches about partnership, France-Afrique ran on three engines: security, currency, and connection. France signed a series of defense agreements with its former colonies, giving itself the right to intervene whenever stability was threatened. From Gabon to Chad to Côte d'Ivoire, French troops landed not with flags, but with missions. Over 50 interventions have taken place since the 1960s, all justified as protecting democracy, citizens, or strategic partners. Then came the money.
They promoted a fiscal regime whereby the franc of Africa was connected to the French franc and later the euro, that would give European companies, would give international companies, French companies, a leg up financially in doing business in Africa.
It ties 14 African nations to the euro, with half their foreign reserves once held in France's treasury.
French control in France-Afrique remained very significant in all of the sub-Saharan colonies, former colonies apart from Guinea. So they were economically and financially linked to France.
The peg promises stability, but critics call it an umbilical cord, a system that lets Paris influence African inflation, borrowing, and trade.
The perception was that it had never properly decolonized, it had never properly left. It was still interfering in African affairs.
When Mali or Burkina Faso talked about creating their own currencies, their presidents faced immediate pushback, sometimes from home, sometimes from Paris.
So they didn't lose the empire, they just rebranded it?
In the 19th century, France spread civilization through catechisms and classrooms. Today, the United States exports it through culture and curriculum.
No longer is there direct rule over most parts of the world that we saw in the 19th and up until the mid-20th century. But still, there remains this kind of commitment of American and European powers to ideas of progress, ideas of capitalism that continue to shape global relations between the global North and the global South.
Paris once projected its language and laws across the world. Today, Washington exports superheroes, syllabi, and streaming platforms. From Hollywood to Ivy League universities, the American imagination runs global syndication. Streaming platforms and social media set the tone of aspiration. What love looks like, how success sounds, even how people argue online. In 2023, more than 80% of the world's top 10 streamed shows came from US-based studios. In sub-Saharan Africa, over half of all screen content viewed online is either American or framed through Western production formats.
But there's also a lot of borrowing from different cultures and inspiration. So for instance, Japanese manga has become incredibly popular in Algeria. Additionally, there's also Bollywood films that have become incredibly popular.
And education follows the same route. Students learn in English, think in Western frameworks, and publish in journals that require American accreditation. English became the global passport of success, the new French of empire.
The nature of decolonization was shaped crucially by African political leaders, by the choices that they made and the actions that they undertook.
From colonial classrooms preaching civilization to modern ministries managing faith, the impulse is the same. Turn devotion into doctrine and believers into citizens. And when faith stops working as leverage, economics picks up the hymn book. Take Ivory Coast and Ghana, neighboring West African nations that together produce nearly 2/3 of the world's cocoa supply, the bean behind every chocolate bar. But here's the plot twist. Of the $100 billion market, several studies estimate that less than 6% of value remains in Africa. The rest melts away in Europe and North America, in branding, processing, and profit margins. Companies like Nestle, Mars, and Ferrero recognize the serious economic and social challenges facing cocoa-growing communities and have been actively working to address them. Operators say partnership beats paralysis. Long concessions bring capital, standards, and global calls. They pledge transparency and shared growth. Critics still ask who holds the keys and for how long.
One's got to say that imperialism is very much present in the modern world, but it varies greatly in its character.
Question, what's the difference between a lifeline and a leash?
It depends on who's holding the other end. In Paris 1885, assimilation looks like freedom on paper. In Silicon Valley 2025, access looks like freedom on the homepage.
If people believe in the importance of the power of your ideas and the power of your convictions, the power of your nation, then they're going to be much more forgiving if that colonial expansion ends up going awry in some sort of way.
When it comes to sort of empire, it's about deconstructing and denigrating local cultures and institutions and trying to replace them with your own, but actually not providing any resources.
History keeps proving it. Control always plants the seed of its undoing. Teach people the language of liberty, and one day they'll use it to ask for their own.
All empires, multi-ethnic and multiracial. And if we look today at our modern nation states, we have huge problems with interethnic and relations, race relations. So perhaps we could learn something from the empires of old, of how they managed these complex relationships between different ethnic groups and different races.
Congratulations, class. You've survived lesson 2. You've learned how to civilize with culture, govern with quotas, and graduate under someone else's rules.
Did I pass? Am I French now?
You sure did. But the test never ends. Graduation is never a guarantee. You can play by the rules, learn the script, pass every trial, only to find the score was never yours to set.